Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and I want you to know if you do or don't believe in God, you are not alone, and we want you to be here with us for good, rational discussion and open inquiry. It's a free thought group, and of atheists and agnostics and others, and it's a show for you. So be with us.
On today's show, we have Tina Shepardson, the Lindsay Young Professor at the Department of Religious Studies at UT, and we'll be grilling you mercilessly.
I hope so.
But first, a few words about the hosts of our program, the sponsors of our program.
Yeah, the Atheist Society of Knoxville has a fund group. And where is that? In Bartley's?
We meet at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria at 5:30 most Tuesdays. So before this show is over, they'll be down there meeting, and I'll be down there later.
So that's the ASK, the Atheist Society of Knoxville, and the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
Yep,
Both
yep.
are sponsors.
The Rationalists of East Tennessee have regular first and third Sunday morning meetings. They are often lectures with lively roundtable discussions. The second Sunday, we hold the Skeptics Book Club. On the fourth Sunday, we're mixing it up sometimes with a get-together we call a reflections meeting. It often features a potluck meal at someone's home. Sometimes we get together and play board games. And now and then we have a blood drive. We're going to do a picnic in September, coinciding with the autumnal equinox as well.
Great.
So later in the show, we will give you our websites to visit for additional details, including times and locations. We don't have anything for In the News today, so we're going to speak with our guest. And maybe you could tell us what I read your title is you are in the Department of Religious Studies, but perhaps there's something more specific.
Well, I am a professor in the Department of Religious Studies, but my focus is on the history of early Christianity. So I do especially the, say, 3rd through 7th centuries of Christianity. So it's a really interesting time when there's a whole lot going on. This is taking place in the Roman Empire, so you have the political framework of the empire meeting the developing communities of various groups of Christians, and so that's the time period I find really exciting to write about.
It's funny, as you said early Christianity and then said 3rd century, that just, doesn't that ring bells? When you talk with students who come the first day of class, and if you were to use that phrase, aren't some of them going to raise their hand and say, what about the 1st and 2nd centuries?
Yeah, sure. And I do talk about those in some classes, the first 2 centuries. But really, when you're doing the period that we call late antiquity, it begins closer to the end of the 3rd century. And that has to do a lot with the development of Christianity, but also the developments within the Roman Empire. So the empire itself changes dramatically in the 3rd to 4th century from what it had been previously, and Christianity also changes dramatically in the first 2 centuries into the period that follows. So really, I think that the first 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries maybe, hang together as one early sort of period of a lot of development, a lot of diversity, a lot of variation in Christianity. But when you get to the 4th century, you suddenly have new imperial control over the development of the church in ways you didn't have to the same extent earlier. So it really begins a new period in the history.
You had much more freedom those first 3 centuries.
Well, much more diversity because there was less connection among the diverse communities. Once you start having sort of imperial control or imperial participation in the development of Christianity's future and definition, then you can't allow it. The empire didn't allow for the same level of diversity that could exist earlier when they were sort of below the radar.
That was a political imposition onto the religion, you think?
I think it went hand in hand. I don't think it was an intentional political imposition, but I think by virtue of an empire needing to make laws about who gets their money, right? If Constantine, who's the emperor in the early 4th century, says, okay, let's fund some of these Christian communities, and you have 12 different types of Christianity showing up to get the money, then you need to decide who gets the money, who gets the political support. And to do that, he started calling councils to determine, all right, you guys figure out who's really the right kind of Christians, and then I'll start supporting them. I'll start funding them, giving political appointments, that sort of thing.
So I guess I can't help but want to rephrase that and say that if you have sturt and church and state entanglement, that inevitably leads the state into deciding what a church is. And that puts the state in charge of putting the stamp of officiality on a church, as opposed to the members themselves.
It goes both ways, but in terms of state definition, and that would be legal definitions, right, and who gets finances, that is determined. Even if you ask the leaders of religious communities to make the definition, it's the state that's going to enforce it. And so you can't have religious people objecting and changing it without the state's acceptance of those changes. But it may be that the religious communities have their own definition. It just means that they're not eligible for the state's religious support in the same way.
All righty.
So that means the bishops are going to be moving toward the financing.
Well, and that's an interesting part of this period from the 4th century onward in Christian history, is you end up with a variety of different religious leaders, a lot of whom are interested in positioning their own communities to be receiving the support of various sorts of support from the government. And so they are criticizing each other, saying, no, that guy has the wrong theology, that group doesn't doesn't practice correctly, these people are interpreting the Bible wrong, I'm the one, my community is the one who should receive the funding from you. And so they end up having conversations, yelling at each other, partly in an effort to determine who's correct, right? Who represents Christianity to the empire.
Would you say that made it almost very difficult to learn from each other, since they had a financial reason not to?
I would say that, although I would say also that by that time they were no longer very interested in learning for each other for different reasons.
Already.
Yeah, I think by the 2nd century you already start to see groups sort of separating themselves and saying, no, it's about interpretation,
Well,
right?
you can find that in the 1st century in the
That's
New
right.
Testament.
That's right. Even as early as Paul's letters, he's already saying, don't listen to these people who've come, as you know. Don't listen to the teachings in Galatia. Don't listen to
Synagogues of Satan. That's strong language.
the Antichrist in one of the, right? There's very strong criticisms of what we today call Gnostic Christianity or Jewish Christianity, both of these different types.
Well, Dr. Shepardson, I've heard this term Gnostic Christianity, and it didn't mean anything to me until I read the Bart Ehrman book on the Gospel of Judas, and I was astounded at how different Gnostic Christianity was. I've been a lifelong non-believer, and as a result, the picture I have of Christianity is superficial at all levels. It's superficial about what Protestants believe and Christians and Catholics believe. But the Gnostic ideas were surprising, and I can't help but think that there must be a viewer out there who would be equally surprised. Could you summarize for me and that viewer some of the differences that you might think are surprising and that your students find surprising in Gnostic?
In the Gnostic Christians, Gnostic Christians emphasize that Jesus was sent directly from God as a divine being, as a teacher to teach the souls that they believed were trapped in the human body and to allow them to have the knowledge after death to go back to the world of the divine. And so Gnosticism turns other forms of Christianity and forms of Judaism on its head by really radically reinterpreting the Hebrew Bible scriptures and arguing, based on a lot of influence from Greek philosophers that were influential at the time, that the material world is not part of the divine world, is not a good thing. And so if the material world is not good, then the creator God who created the material world can't be the highest God. And that's where you get some of the major changes from Gnostic Christianity to compared to other forms of Christianity. They believe that the perfect, all-knowing, an unchanging God is not the God of the creation story. So they don't use the Hebrew Bible. They believe that the serpent and Eve were the heroes of that story rather than Adam. Right? So they turn everything on its head, but it's through biblical interpretation, which is what all of the early Christians and Jews were involved in.
So the Bible in some ways was just up for grabs.
In terms of interpreting it correctly, right? As soon as you have the resurrection stories about Jesus circulating, that causes people to start reinterpreting Scripture. But also in the year 70, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem at the end of the first century, and that led all Jews and all Christians to start reinterpreting Scripture because you could no longer have altar sacrifices, the priestly sort of type of Judaism that had recently been dominant in that region. So everybody was reinterpreting, but it led to a very diverse collection of outcomes of Christianities and Judaisms.
Well, you know, in previous centuries, the first temple had been destroyed, and the Jewish people experienced a displacement, which they then had to somehow kind of reconcile with their holy books that claimed that there would always be a descendant of David on the throne. So in 79 AD, the same sort of thing must have happened to them, that they must have said, all right, we're being punished. And how did they maintain a story that somehow the descendant of David is on the throne?
So 70 CE is
70.
the year, not 79. And so it depends if you think that we're still talking today about a Judaism that believes there's a king of David on the throne, right? So that is not central to all forms
But
of
in,
Judaism.
you said 70, thank you for
Yes,
correcting me.
yes.
In 70, that would have been a pressing problem to them, because the year before they had a king on the throne.
It wasn't a king, right?
Well,
there was King Herod, right, appointed by the Romans, but he
All
was
right.
not accepted by a lot of the Romans who lived, a lot of the Roman Jews who lived there. So it wasn't the king that was at stake; it was the priests who were at stake. So it's the upsetting thing about the temple's destruction had more to do with the end of the priestly order and the sacrificial system and the following of Levitical laws that required a temple to be in Jerusalem. So it was the loss of the temple and the priests and the sacrifices more so than the king of David. And if you want to know how they did it, they've done it in Christianity as well, right? So we tend to think that Judaism continued while Christianity went off and did something new. But after the year 70, all of those groups are having to do something radically new. And Christians aren't unique in having to reinterpret Scripture.
Reinterpretation
In the
is
late
constantly,
first century,
yeah.
Jews are also needing to, and this is the birth of the rabbinic movement in some ways, right? And so rabbinic Judaism, which we have all around us
Well,
today,
you can see it, say, from 586
BCE.
on BCE, you can see all kinds. I mean, angels come in strongly. You didn't have them that much before then.
So you have this huge diversity within the
enormous
traditions.
diversity, yeah. Enoch, Ethiopic Enoch, and all those books. And
All right. So I've drug us back into the first century, and you wanted to talk about
you
third
have.
century.
Critical error.
that's good. But
So in the third century, you're talking about these various groups that are vying for funding and therefore trying to say, I have the true religion.
Yeah, so let's do the 4th century, which is the period I was talking about
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
funding, right? So in the 4th century, you have the Emperor Constantine, who a lot of people have heard about. What did he do for Christianity or for the Roman Empire? One thing he did was to, and we can talk about why he did it or the stories about why he did it, but the fact is he started for the first time to give imperial funds and make legislation that was supportive of certain Christian communities. And so that support, it didn't mean that Christians before weren't saying, we're the right kind of religion, I'm the right kind of Christian, but now somebody who says it after Constantine actually has the imperial backing, and that means it's a much more powerful statement than it was before.
So you can see this in this country, people wanting to make this a, quote, Christian nation.
Yeah.
And then you wanted to have then a Christian Roman Empire. Some wanted to do that, it seemed to me.
That's right. And so that wouldn't be Constantine, but that would be Theodosius by the end of the 4th
Theodosius,
century.
yeah.
So
And
that's
Eusebius was moving in that direction. seemed to-
Eusebius was hoping for that, and Eusebius was Bishop of Caesarea during the time of Constantine in the early 4th century. And he was a biographer for the emperor, and he wrote this biography that really praises Constantine as the person who sent by God to bring Christianity into the limelight and the power of the Roman Empire.
I won't drag us back to it, but I remember why I asked the question, and that was Gnostic ideas were so surprising, and that's because they were essentially extinguished, or in large part extinguished, by this process that Constantine set in place, that the Gnostics weren't on the winning side of this argument, and so many of their documents were, the word lost doesn't do it justice. They were
burned,
they
destroyed,
were suppressed.
and the lucky ones were buried where we might find them again, some of which we've found.
Would you say that they were buried physically, but many of their ideas were absorbed?
I would say that Gnosticism did have an influence on the larger development of Christianity, but not only in peripheral ways, I think. I mean, I think in the sense that the other Christians had to respond to the teachings of Gnosticism. It shaped their teachings to respond to it.
That's the impact of Gnosticism, is they were a common enemy to some extent, and that helped shape part of Christianity, wouldn't you think?
And so once you get to the 4th and the 5th century, what you have that's different from the Gnostic Christians is you have schisms, you have breaks within the Christian churches that in fact still survive till today. Right?
So what would be the issues over which they broke? There must be an interesting list here.
But this is
Very
interesting, though.
list,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So if we want to start with the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, he called the first what's called ecumenical council, which means worldwide council. And so all the bishops who were recognized as bishops, so right there that puts some people out, by the empire, were invited to a council to resolve some of the pressing issues that were causing conflict at that time. So that's the first under Constantine, and we can talk about what they talked about and what it led to. But there's a whole series in the 4th, 5th, 6th century. There's 2 in the 4th century, 2 in the 5th century, and 3 of those councils led to schisms that still separate Christians today. So the outcome of the council would be supported by the emperor, whoever called it, and said, all right, you bishops decide the answer, and then I will put my government's power behind supporting your answer. But even though that's true, some of the losing sides of those councils still survive to this day in our world, like the Assyrian Church of the East, which was dominant in what was ancient Persia, now Iran, the various Miaphysite Christians, which are the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is in Egypt, the Syrian Orthodox Church in Syria, Armenia, Ethiopia. All of those, to this day, follow a Christian theology that was rejected by one of these imperially sanctioned councils in the 5th century.
That had to do with the nature of Christ?
It does,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay,
yeah,
good.
and it gets
Talk about
well,
that.
so the differences are very fine to us when we're looking at the ancient Greek words that they're using. So some of the concepts they disagree over are enormous, right? But they got close enough. They were trying to find language that would compromise between these different sides of these different debates.
Explain the Monophysites.
Okay,
that'll help.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the first council, and then we'll go to the.
We'll move to that
we don't have to go through all of them, but this one's an easy one to see how close the language came. So the Council of Nicaea in 325, called by the Emperor Constantine, gives us part of the creed that today a lot of churches use, called the Nicene Creed, although that's shorthand for the creed that actually came out of the Second Council at Constantinople. So this creed, they were fighting over a lot of things, but the one thing that really was the focus of so much of the controversy was whether the second person of the Trinity, so Christian Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, whether the Son is the same substance as God the Father, or a different substance, or a similar substance, right? To us, very fine details of philosophy or theology. And in fact, when you look at the Greek, it comes down to a difference of one letter, right?
Go ahead, yeah.
So they are willing to say one group is fighting for the same substance, another group is fighting for the similar substance, And the words in Greek are homoousios and homoiousios, and the letter I, a iota in Greek, is
Iota,
the
right.
only difference between those two words. But it matters what you write
Yeah.
into the creed, because people are going to say that creed in liturgy, and they are going to repeat it and learn it, and that's going to be doctrine. And
So it's a
it
difference between
matters.
if he's the same or he's like.
Which is a huge difference in
Yeah.
terms of theology,
Yeah.
right? It matters whether you have two gods to some people
Uh-huh.
or one God. It matters to other people whether the Son was there at the beginning of creation, right? That's the other side of the story. But when you're actually writing it, it's a difference of just a stroke of a letter, a little I in the word. So it's fascinating how this came to be.
All right. And so I'm aware of the Coptic Christians because
Yes,
of my
yes.
interest in ancient Egypt and
Right.
the fact that they preserved some of the ancient Egyptian language, and I believe that a lot of the Gnostic Gospels have been discovered in Egypt. So I'm guessing
Handwritten
Gnosticism
in
was
Coptic.
stronger in Egypt. So and you're referring to them as part of Monophysite?
Yeah, let me talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit. So that's a good question. So yes, Gnostics were common in Egypt in the 2nd century. They do not seem to have a whole lot of connection to the 5th century later controversies.
Okay.
But they were writing in the same language, they were living in the same region, but there's several hundred years difference between them.
So there is a break there.
There's a bit of a break.
Yeah.
The Gnostic documents get buried, and we just happen to find them.
So the Miaphysite argument is a later argument, as you were saying, over natures, right? Again, about
All
the
right.
Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The question at hand in that one is the Son, so sometimes called Jesus, right? Is the Son in the Trinity, is the Son one person, two persons, one nature, two natures,
natures.
and this has to do with the human and divine aspects of the Son,
So
right?
talk about a little bit of
Right.
Arius.
Okay, so they all agree that all the Christians in the 5th century that we're talking about agree that Jesus was human and divine, that Jesus was even fully human and fully divine. But then the question is, does that mean that Jesus had one component that was human and one component that was divine,
Good.
and in his body these two pieces sat side by side to each other, or did those two pieces get fused so tightly that they were just one thing that combined the fully human and fully divine? And so again, these sort of very convoluted, complex philosophical or theological ideas end up dividing churches apart from each other and people apart from
Now,
each
that's
other.
the irony.
That's the irony, of course.
The unity of Christ issue divided the church.
Interesting. As you were describing how they were arguing over the nature of substances being
Yeah,
together,
yeah.
it occurred to me, of course, that they didn't have an atomic worldview.
Right.
They had a worldview that stems from the Greeks, where they talk about these elements of,
Although Epicurus had atoms, right?
there were Greeks who were arguing for an
Democritus
atomic
and
theory as well.
Epicurus.
Yeah.
But they were kind of in the minority, and the groups that held the larger argument or carried the argument would have been Plato and Aristotle, where they talked about these ideal things and rather simple stuff. You saw this over and over again, where there would be 4 elements, and then they would talk about the components of the body as 4 humors. And as you described this, it occurred to me, well, in a sense, they're stuck with the vocabulary and mindset of the Greeks that
They
talk
are
about...
Greeks, in fact.
Okay,
Right,
but what you had with Empedocles, you had air, earth, fire, and water.
Yeah.
Then you had strife, split them apart, and you had eros, love, brought them
bring
together.
them together.
And that was a kind of a cosmology. And then you had the early Christians turned eros gradually into logos and wisdom, which is the unifying principle. And that, of course, came out of the Hebrew tradition. Interacting, I would say, with the Platonists over there in northern Egypt. And so they were trying to say, how did all this fragmentation that Heraclitus talked about come about? Well, Heraclitus already had the Logos principle to bring all this together. And so some of the early Christians turned Heraclitus' Logos into Jesus and called Logos the Word.
And the Stoics were a big influence. The
Big
Stoics
influence,
had
yes.
a large influence. So I wonder, you said you might invite people to call in, and
yes.
I wonder if maybe mentioning some of the politics of what I've been talking about might get people interested. I don't know. So part of
viewers,
what's
the line,
interesting-
the phone number's on your screen. Please give us a call. We're talking about the early Christianity in the 3rd through 7th centuries. Did I get it right this time? All righty.
And particularly, I think I'm going to spend a little time now talking about the politics of that, right? We've talked a little bit about Constantine's adoption of legislation that supports Christianity in various ways, but we haven't talked about the politics of the councils themselves. And these councils maybe, aren't part of a lot of people's sort of world, but the teachings that were decided on at these councils, whether people know it or not, are the basis for the theology of almost all of the world's churches
Try to
today.
give us some indication of the first council, which is so crucial. Talk to us about the first council.
Right, so you have, each of these councils has a couple of major figures, and the first council's major figures are Athanasius and Arius, and they have this local fight in Egypt, right, and it gets brought to this imperial council, and people take sides, and so they end up taking votes at the end of the council,
And
right?
the issue over which they were...
Well, this one is
split?
the homoousios.
yeah.
This
All right,
is the
all right.
same nature versus similar nature, first and second person of the Trinity. But the thing is, they come up with a vote. Like, they have their chance to have their say. They argue with each other. The Council of Nicaea is famous for bishops actually physically punching each other because they get so upset with each other, dragging them out again into the streets. And after all of this conversation, they take a vote. And so there is a politicized element, because at the vote, you have not only who's persuaded whom with their biblical arguments and their philosophical and theological arguments, you also have the fact that Alexandria has a strong support from the city of Rome, for example.
All righty. Well, we've apparently got a call here.
Talk.
Hello, you're on Freethought TV. Can you give us a name or a nickname, please?
Oh, you can just call me Caller.
Hello, caller. Thank you.
No
And
chance of getting confused with anyone else.
all right. I don't think we've confused you, caller.
Go ahead.
Do you have a question for our guest, Dr. Shepardson? Did I get no?
That's right.
All right, Shepardson.
We'll go with it.
Without the second H. Huh?
Well, I don't mean to be so formal, but I am really pleased that Dr. Shepardson would come on here and talk about the politics of early Christianity. I have been curious about that for so many years,
Great.
and I'd just like to say I thank you for offering this forum.
Well, absolutely. I'm pleased to be here. Is there anything in particular that I can talk about that has been on your mind or that this conversation has sparked for you?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there is. I've read the Gospels of the King James and all that. And here, I'd like your opinion. Do you think that, well, I mean, you probably draw from a lot more resources than just the Gospels, but do you think that Jesus supported or opposed the Roman rule of Israel?
Roman rule over Roman Palestine, is that what you're talking about? The location that's the modern state of Israel?
Yeah, that's what he's.
Okay, so we have the Gospels to work with for that. You're absolutely right that our source of information for what Jesus thought is the collection of Gospel stories, not only the 4 that are in the New Testament, but also if we sort of want to include the non-canonical ones, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel
Well, when it comes to non-canonical, that just leads to other nonsense, like other experts
Okay,
giving their opinions. I just sort of restrict my myself to the Gospels.
So if you're
what I
reading
was
the
asking
Gospel,
you was,
if you're reading the Gospels that are in the New Testament today, then you already know what you have to work with, right? That you can give either answer to the question that you've asked and find support for it in the Gospel. I mean, certainly he says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's," and that's a sentence that gets pulled out of the Gospels. It's unusual because it's in all four of the canonical Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas among the non-canonical Gospels. So that's an answer you could use to answer your question, but there are other passages that you could choose instead if you preferred.
well, you are probably the person to ask. Did Jesus ever speak poorly about Rome or any Roman or Roman rulers or anything having to do with Rome?
Right. So unfortunately, all we know about what Jesus said and did is what was left to us in the writings that we have by other people. So we have very little direct access to Jesus' thoughts, his feelings, anything else that wasn't recorded, right, in the gospel stories. So unfortunately, I'm left in the same conundrum that you are, that it's very difficult, at least historically it's not possible to access that other information.
Could you say that if Jesus had 12 disciples and they were talking of who was going to be the first in the kingdom, and they weren't thinking of it as 2,000 years hence,
Yeah.
that they were then thinking of then and now kingdom,
Yeah.
and that would be considered to be a rival to Rome.
Absolutely. So one important thing that Joe's pointing out is that whether or not Jesus thought of himself as anti-Roman government, he was perceived that way by the Roman government, right? So that
Would you say that he had an apocalyptic vision of a divine intervention?
Would I say what Jesus thought? No. but
What'd you
but
say?
I would say that the Gospels describe that Jesus rode into Jerusalem at the height of a pilgrimage festival for Passover on a donkey, right, with people praising him in the way that a king would enter into the holy city. And so that itself, whatever Jesus was thinking, which I don't have access to,
that's a good
for
point.
sure we know that the Roman soldiers would have been worried that this was a political
Is there any
maneuver.
evidence that Jesus could even write?
Actually, yes, there is.
There's
Yeah, he
one
wrote on
story
the-
in the Gospel of John about him writing in the sand, but we don't know what he wrote.
No, he could have just been scribbling.
Actually, if you're able to read Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic,
Which I am.
I could make a safe guess that you're probably able to write.
But maybe he was listening to the scribes in the temple and not reading himself.
Yeah, it's very important to know that in the Roman Empire, those two skills were actually totally separate skills. Today we teach them together, right? Today, literacy for us is both reading and writing. And when we go to first grade,
good
we
point.
learn them together. But in the Roman world, they were different
They were
skills.
greatly
There were
different.
people who could read who couldn't write, and people who could write who couldn't read.
I doubt that. But what I
Okay.
would like to do
I can't
is
change your
to
mind. There you go. You can look it up in any historical documents, any historical sources.
There's plenty of evidence. In fact, I would doubt what he doubts. That's a good part.
Actually,
of
I
the program.
was hoping to ask Faithless.
Go.
Yes, caller?
I understand that you have read the Bible. So what I'd like to do is ask you, did Jesus support or oppose Roman rule in Israel during his lifetime?
It's a trick question.
Yeah, well, and the answer is yes.
Yes, he...
Yes.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate this opportunity to ask pointed questions about politics, and I do appreciate those pointed answers.
We're almost,
right.
we're almost
Caller?
as vague as the
I
question.
have a theory, though.
Okay,
All right,
I
well,
thought we were getting
please,
out of it.
please
Go ahead,
be
let's
quick,
hear it.
caller, and then we'll clear the line so that others can call in. So give us your theory quick.
Oh, my theory is that Jesus never said a blessed bad thing about Rome, Romans, or any Roman.
Okay.
All right.
He-
That
he
pipe.
said-
That Monty
I like
Python movie certainly comes to mind right now.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Caller, thank you so much, and we'll wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you.
All righty. We're past the halfway point here, so maybe we could encourage viewers to call in and talk to the call screener. And Joe, let's do the mid-program break.
Okay.
Can you find your notes? I can grab the first part of them while you catch up. In case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contributions. Shows are live most Tuesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. on Knoxville Community Access Television Station 12 or 194, depending upon your local cable network. Tell your out-of-town friends they can see us streaming online at ctvknox.org.
Okay, and this is a call-in show, and this is August the 25th, if I'm not mistaken. And viewers can call in to our show, as we've already experienced, and give us our comments or questions, and then we can have an informative break.
All right, and are we ready to run the video?
If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
All right, we're back. The Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets 2 times a week. We have evening meetups for fun, food, drink, and conversation. ASK's purpose is to supply a venue for community camaraderie and outreach to atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers and other like-minded persons in the East Tennessee area. Our Tuesday meeting is going on now at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria in the Old City.
Okay, and the Sunday of most months is the Skeptics Book Club, and you may know more about the dating on this than I do. The title of the September Club is Culture Wars, and then, of course, the September 13th at 2 o'clock, the public is invited to participate in the discussion. You don't have to have read the book.
But, of course, it helps.
It helps, but you don't have to. And visit rationalists.org to find the rest of the calendar of books and join us in the new location at where? Books a Million. Books a Million.
And that's 8513 Kingston Pike, Knoxville, Tennessee. Both the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee help provide a social outlet where you'll find that if you don't believe in Zeus or follow Zoroaster or say yuck to Yahweh, you're not alone.
Okay. So
all right.
Let's get back to our...
Well, viewers, yes. We have a guest today, Dr. Tina Shepardson, the Lindsay Young Professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Tennessee. And we've talked a little bit about the First Nicene Council, and we're going to move on to talk about additional ones.
Yeah, there's a really interesting one that happened in the 5th century that I think would be fun to spend a few minutes on, especially under the theme of politics of early Christianity.
Now, and help me, I know some viewers out there might be confused about that. When you say 5th century, you don't mean like the year 520-something. You mean the year 400 and
That's exactly right.
What will be the year or years involved in this 5th century?
Okay, so there are two councils, but the one that I'm going to start with is 431. So, which is the 3rd Ecumenical Council, if you're keeping track. The first one was in Nicaea in 325, the second was in Constantinople in 381, And the third, which I'm going to talk about, was in 431 in the
Okay.
city of Ephesus. So the things that I find interesting about this council in terms of the politics of early Christian history are that, like most councils, it was called because there was a major debate, a major argument about Christian theology. And there were representatives of the two major sides of this controversy. So there was one guy called Cyril. He was bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. And there's a guy called Nestorius, and he was the bishop of Constantinople. Very powerful cities. Constantinople was the imperial capital. Alexandria was a long-standing major metropolis in Egypt. So they both were two of the most powerful Christian leaders on the planet at that time, right? And so Cyril and Nestorius disagreed. If we want to talk about what they disagreed about, they can.
Summarize that at least.
All right, the summary,
yeah.
the summary is back to the idea of the Christian Trinity and the three persons. Again, about the second person, the Son of God. This is the one about whether the human part of the Son and the divine part of the Son are held together as two separate pieces, or they combine and make one coherent piece. And so this comes up in a question about Jesus' mother, Mary, right? So the Christians say, well, Mary was the bearer of God because she held the Son of God in her belly for 9 months while Jesus was, before he was born. And so, so Nestorius got very upset and said, no, no, no. Mary could only bear the human part. She could. How could a human being hold God actually in gestation inside her? So Nestorius argued there must be two pieces to the Son of God: the human part that Mary could have in the womb, and then the divine part that at the moment of incarnation, at the moment of birth, those two were fused together, the human and divine.
At the moment of birth, not conception.
Not
'Cause of course,
conception.
they probably didn't have.
Roman
Well,
world.
let me
they don't
ask-
have anything. They didn't. They wouldn't have our idea about conception because they didn't understand cells.
Well, you had among the Greeks, however, who had gods
Yes.
on earth were human
Yes.
already.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, I don't know, but I wonder how much male ego is involved in
Well,
this.
I don't
issue.
think I better address that at this table. But
Okay, I got you.
but I will say that because the idea of God humans was familiar in the Greek world, the idea of the goddess Artemis as a sort of popular god was a very, very important figure in the city of Ephesus. And the council was held in that city in order to help support Cyril of Alexandria, right? He had it held there
that's-
because it helped support his side.
Yeah, now that's
Oh.
crucial. Okay, we got a
Absolutely.
phone call.
All righty.
That's crucial.
Well, caller, you've reached Freethought Forum TV. Can we get a name or a nickname? Please speak up a little bit.
My name's Ed.
Hello, Ed. Did we get it right? Is it Ed?
Right.
Okay, great. Can you give us a comment or question?
Well, I just come in from work here, and I happened to flip on the channel and caught you guys. I talked to your host there. He's very, very informative. What I was talking about, I don't really understand the whole viewpoint of atheist, being an atheist. Now, I happen to believe I'm a Christian man, and it's like I was saying. You talk about God, you talk about Jesus, you talk about the Gospels, you talk about all of this biblical facts, information, everything else. It's not my job to be argumentative about any of it. Okay? But how do we engage in conversations in situations that we don't believe in?
So let me just answer, before we get to the atheist question, let me clarify, since you just tuned in, that I'm here as a professor of history. And so I'm coming at this from a historical perspective, which is not to say atheistic or non-Christian or Christian. It's to say that this is the historical information of the context in which these other questions come up. And now I'll hand it to one of you to address
that's
the...
a very good distinction. The job of a professor primarily is to present a variety of views accurately and not cheat. And whether you're an atheist, a theist, or what kind of atheist, there are different kinds of atheists with different denominations among atheists. And there are different denominations among Christians. and among Jews. And the job of a teacher is to present each view accurately, and then in order to do that, she or he has to try to get inside each view to try to understand it, their scriptures or whatever their literature is, clearly, and not cheat.
Yeah.
And that's why they quote various viewpoints of scriptures, you see.
So, Ed, I think I can address some of your question head on. I'm a lifelong non-believer. I've never believed in a divine Jesus or a creator God Yahweh. And I don't believe that there was a Zeus who threw lightning bolts off of Mount Olympus. And I don't believe that the Egyptian gods were real either. So I'm a polyatheist. I disbelieve in many gods. So an important thing for you to understand is that you're an atheist too with respect to almost all the gods humans have ever invented. I believe humans have invented all the gods. Now, I find, though, that the stories that humans invent about gods are interesting because they are often a mirror. They're a mirror about a culture that, by reading these stories, we can visit these cultures. Some of these cultures are even long dead. Ed, have you ever read the story of Gilgamesh or heard of the story of Gilgamesh?
No.
Gilgamesh is, when I was in 7th grade, claimed to be the world's oldest literature, the world's oldest story. Gilgamesh was, a king of a city in Sumer, the land between the rivers. The city's name escapes me, but he has
Tigris and
these
Euphrates rivers, yeah.
he has these adventures, and these adventures are actually quite alien feeling to us because they come from a mindset of a culture that's 5,000 years in the past. But I will also say, though, that I have found great pleasure in learning about the early Christian era. Once again, it's especially interesting when you run into differences. And as I was grilling our professor here, both before the show started and on the show, about Gnostic beliefs, because they were surprisingly different. So, have I answered your question as to why we are today talking about early Christianity, even though I sit here as a lifelong non-believer?
Well, yeah. Let me
right.
ask you something else. Do
Sure.
you believe that there has been or will be ever any alien or off of this planet creation discovered?
Well, when you say creation, the word creation could mean many things. Please try and summarize what you mean by creation.
Well, for instance, do you think that we have aliens? I don't know what you would use in the direct description of that. A non-human, in other words, different from the gene and the DNA of what we are classified as human beings on this planet.
Okay. Well, so the question could still be interpreted several ways. I don't think they're flying saucers that have ever made it to Earth, because I don't think that any civilization capable of crossing interstellar space is going to get here and then mess up and crash and leave evidence if they didn't want to be found. Now, the world around us and the history that we can read in the rocks of past life shows us an interesting story. There's evidence of life that is about 3.2 billion years old. The surface of the Earth became solid somewhere around, probably 4.2 billion years ago. So evidence of life on Earth happens relatively soon after the Earth has a surface capable of a hard surface with oceans. So it kind of looks, from the small sample size we have, that life starts pretty easily. But for most of the Earth's history of nearly 4.5 billion years, life was single-celled. It is only about 1.2 billion years ago that there's evidence of life that has a cellular nucleus, and that may mean that sexual reproduction began with cells. And then somewhere, probably less than that time, but more than something like 600 million years ago, multicellular life begins. So That's the very early outline of evolution that leads to
So
animals and plants that have bodies. They're not just one cells.
So our species just barely got here in the first place.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that life on Earth has mostly been single cell, and that's probably the kind of things that we would see in the universe around us, and that multicellularity may not be as common, and multicellularity complex, less common. So that's what I think the universe is like out there. You know, the things that NASA is doing is letting us soon be able to measure the chemistry of planets, of the atmospheres of planets around other stars. In the next 10 years, we may learn some interesting things. So I hope to live through that period of discovery.
It'd be fascinating.
Ed, did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. I appreciate your time. You guys, I mean, you know, here's the thing about it. We live in the greatest country in the world.
It is
And
interesting.
everybody can voice their opinion, and everybody can voice their beliefs,
That's a good point.
and everybody has the right to do it.
All right.
Thank you.
Ed,
And you know what?
Ed,
If there's many people,
go on.
I told somebody the other day, if you don't stand for something, you don't stand for anything.
You got a good point.
All right.
I appreciate it, guys.
Thank you very
Ed,
much.
a couple quick questions for callers. Are you local?
Yes.
All right. And I often ask if you watched before. I think you maybe already implied that you were just flipping through the channels. So this
Right.
is the
I
first
just
time?
come in and flopped down after a hot day, so I just was.
All right.
Well,
And
but
I heard some of the comments. You know, I wasn't abreast on all of it, but I heard some of that. And then the caller you had before, you know, I
where'd you
don't understand nothing about that one.
where,
but
where did you
anyway.
go to high school? Where did you go to,
Anyway.
I'm interested. Where did you go to high school?
Went to Rural High School,
Oh.
inner city Knoxville.
I don't like Rural High. They used to beat us in football in Knoxville High.
That's been a long time
Long
ago.
time
That was
ago.
in
Long
1965.
Thank,
All right, guys, I appreciate it.
thank you for
Thank you.
calling, Ed.
Bye-bye.
That was
All right.
good questions.
Well, we've got about 7 minutes left here, and we were talking about this council at Ephesus. Did I get that
Ephesus.
right?
You did.
And I
You
didn't
did.
mangle it?
No, not at all.
And
wanna try
once
again?
no, no. So they were arguing over the nature of Jesus. Imagine that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I find interesting about this council is that you can really start to see the imperial politics playing a role in shaping the theological outcomes of these councils. And so at this council you have two men, the Bishop of Alexandria named Cyril, the Bishop of Constantinople named Nestorius. They both have strong followers, they both have strong opinions. But who wins? It's the guy who has the support of the Bishop of Rome, this guy who has the support of the emperor's older and very influential sister, right? And so he sort of, he has these very powerful people around him who are helping to support his side. And although the emperor, who's Theodosius II by that point, wants initially to support Nestorius, Nestorius is eventually exiled because the emperor's older sister has her thumb on him and is like, you can't support that. That's the wrong answer. You need to support the other guy. And so between the Bishop of Rome, the emperor's sister, and a few other major players, Cyril ends up getting the support of enough people that he is declared the winner of that council. And Nestorius, even though he had been appointed by the emperor as the most powerful person in the church, the Bishop of Constantinople at that point, he was sent into exile and wasn't allowed to practice his kind of Christianity in the empire anymore. So that's a case where we see there's a whole lot more than just theology that's at stake here.
Well, you can
in
see
these
it
councils.
in denominations since then.
Sure.
The same kind of thing taking place sometimes.
Sure, absolutely.
So, you know, this past spring, there was a Tennessee legislator who proposed a bill to make the Bible the state's book. And, you know, I couldn't help but think that, man, I would love to ask him which Bible, because that would be the same kind of problem.
You do have
And-
so many different translations. You'd first have to clarify he probably meant the Christian Bible, but there is also the Jewish Bible.
And
He-
how about the
you
Book of
could
Mormon?
Well,
ask-
The Book of
actually,
Mormon,
he did address that. I read at least the summary of the bill, if not the whole thing, and they said specifically, including the Hebrew Bible. But it wasn't clear to me from reading that they understood that, the Catholic Bible has additional books in it. I guess that's what goes by the word apocrypha.
That's right.
Right, so after I read the Bible, I realized I hadn't read the Bible because I'd read a Gideon Bible. I picked it up at a motel.
That's what they're there for.
And so it was a kind of, it was a surprise to me. Oh, there's more than one.
There's more
Even
to
the
it.
Gideon Bible includes a few things that probably wasn't in the New Testament.
Well, I would have said, that I was aware there were different translations. It didn't occur to me that they would leave whole books out, and that wouldn't be a problem. And of course, then I learned that it is a problem.
It is
yes.
a problem. Let me clear, it is a problem.
Major problem.
Yeah, but it is interesting to most people that
We
that
got-
there are in fact multiple Christian Bibles. There's the Catholic Bible, the Protestant Bible, and then there's also the sort of Eastern Christian
Orthodox, yeah.
Bibles.
All right.
We got a little more time.
Well, hello,
Go.
caller. We're going to have to ask you to be real quick because we're running low on time. Give us a name or a nickname, please.
Jeremy.
Hello, Jeremy. Now give us a comment or a question, please.
I heard you talking briefly about the universe not having that many multi-celled life and things. What I'm wondering is, even if there are only 2 or 3 planets like that, there could be intelligent life out there. And what I wonder is, how do you know that the God that Christians worship isn't an E.T.? How do you know that pillar of fire next to us isn't a cigar-shaped UFO? I mean, how do you know that it's not actually?
Well, of course, there is a line from Arthur C. Clarke that he says any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. But I think the argument I was making is that life is likely to be common in the universe, but intelligent life is not. And in fact, multicellular life is maybe kind of a chancy thing. But do you have a comment or a question for our guest here about the early Christianity?
No, I just wanted to point that out to you that
Sure.
you don't believe in God. He could be an E.T.
And in fact, there's arguments that life begins it's called. We'll have to address it on another show. Jeremy, thanks for calling. We're going to drop you so that we can talk to our visitor a little more.
Okay.
And please call another time.
Okay.
All right. Well, we've got about a minute or so left where you can
No
talk
problem.
about things.
No problem. I think maybe the thing I want to end with is just the observation that is unfamiliar to a lot of people who live in the States, which is that these councils had such impact in terms of the theology that comes out of them. They are behind the theology of most churches today on the planet, everywhere, but that the decisions that were made also led to groups that aren't familiar to us today, like the Coptic Egyptian Christian Church, is the people who lost one of
Lost
these
the
early
battle, yeah.
councils and yet still survived. And the reasons for their survival are also interesting in their own right. It has to do with the early rise of Islam, actually.
Yeah.
All right.
That's a good point, yeah. About the Semitic controversy and the whole.
Well, and just that they were politically not under the Byzantine Empire 100 years later, because the people came up from the Arab Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula.
That's a whole
Well,
new program we could
there
have
you
you
go.
on.
I'll already say it's a shame I have to work for a living and I can't be in your class. What time is your class typically?
I teach, right now I'm teaching at 11:15 and at 2:30 on
All
Monday,
right.
Wednesday, Friday.
Well, I wish I could be there and learn more of these things, but we need to wrap up now.
Yes, thank
So,
you.
let's see. Please get out your pen and paper. This has been Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart. Give us your feedback if you can, and leave us a voicemail. And the number is on the screen for
Well,
you.
the voicemail number is 865-272-9060, and you can send email in to freethoughtforum@yahoo.com.
And you can see the show every Tuesday at 5 o'clock.
All right, and you can tell your out-of-town viewers, our friends, to view us online at CTV KNOX. Opinions expressed on the show are of the hosts and guests and not any official opinion of ASK or RET. See us next week.